Welcome to the Advocacy Exchange. I am Dave Craig, the CEO of Grit Health, and we are bringing this initiative to you in partnership with Bristol Myers Squibb. So honored to have them and so many other team members with us at all of these stages. Today marks a significant milestone and evolution in the Advocacy Exchange, and we're excited to tell you about what that is, but most importantly, to co-create this next step with you. And so if we think back to how we've evolved over these last few years, we started with connection, we then moved to conversation, and we are now focused on change. Connection was all about the beginning of COVID and how many of our events were being canceled or postponed, how so many advocacy initiatives were put on pause, and really medicine's development and access to care were really interrupted globally. And so the purpose was to bring us together to solve problems and create connection during such upheaval globally in the advocacy world. We then moved to bold and authentic conversations, and we got to hear from individuals about their lived experience and talk boldly and authentically about the things that aren't talked openly enough about or in the right spaces. And today, you're going to have a chance to meet or reconnect with our working group leaders. These are individuals that have spent their careers and their passions creating change in each of our areas. And so we're going to give you a quick interview of the journey we've taken so far, and then welcome you to be a part of this journey going forward. What we're creating, or co-creating rather, is truly unique in that most times when we talk about addressing disparities, oftentimes it's the system organizations that are creating the principles and then giving or telling them to individuals. We are flipping the paradigm. We are starting with individuals and their lived experiences to co-create new approaches together. And so we thank everybody who has been a part of that journey so far through these first phases. And we hope you and anybody else that wants to be a part of this going forward feels welcome and can contribute. The two projects that we're going to share with you today specifically are to create a resource for individuals experiencing racism and discrimination in the healthcare system. And the second one is to create a resource so that individuals who want to use their voice can understand the landscape and identify places where their voice is relevant for them. Both of these are first initiatives, and we are so honored to be a part of them with the leaders who can help us lead through them. It's also important that I notice we have our two ASL interpreters here with us today. So our gratitude to Isabella Olson and Emily Cook, who will be with us for this full session. Please feel free to toggle back and forth on your view if you want to pin these interpreters so you can see them during the sessions. Okay. I have the honor now to shift to Sheila Thorne, and it is important that I start by sharing with you the lifelong legacy that Sheila has been building. She is a native New Yorker and former senior executive in 5 preeminent marketing and communications agencies. Sheila has spent more than 2 decades designing marketing, media, and health education campaigns for the top 50 pharmaceutical companies across a broad range of therapeutic areas, from molecule all the way to market. And Sheila Thorne happens to be one of the most positive influences in my life. Please help me welcome Sheila Thorne.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, David, for that wonderful introduction. It is an honor and a privilege to be a part of this ongoing, courageous conversation that Grit Health and Bristol Myers Squibb started some few years ago. And in addition to what David shared with you, I have to say that as I look back on the 27 years I've been in this multicultural space, this is truly a pivotal moment. It's a watershed moment. It's a time when all of us who have been talking about this for decades are now ready to put our feet to action and make sure that everyone has the opportunity to achieve their optimal health. And that's what health equity is all about, no matter what they look like, what language they speak, or where they come from. So it is my honor and privilege to have worked with Grit Health and many visionary pharmaceutical executives who really see the need to do a focus and intentional conversation and action about how to reach these populations more effectively and more productively and in a culturally competent way. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. I'm going to introduce your colleague in this project that you're co-creating in this initiative. Dr. Brad Love has been one of my mentors for the last decade now. I met Brad when I was trying to recover from my second cancer diagnosis as a young adult survivor. And Brad was part of the legacy of individuals that were fighting to make young adult cancer not just a thing, but a thing with resources and research and ways to create positive outcomes. And so I have the true honor to introduce to you Dr. Brad Love. And Brad has worked with all of his heart to help people thrive in their lives. At the University of Texas at Austin, he serves as the distinguished teaching professor and as an associate professor in the Center for Health Communication. And he works tirelessly focusing on improving quality of life for young adults specifically affected by cancer. In particular, Brad's research focuses on boosting access to mental health, social, and informational support. Please help me welcome one of my mentors and a leader with Grit Health, Brad Love.
Thank you, David. That's very kind of you. And I'm delighted to be here with all of you advocates. As Sheila was saying, this is a moment of change that we get to co-create, that we get to co-lead, and that we get to build from your experience, because you're the ones who've lived it and you know where change needs to happen. So that's what we're here to do today and going forward. And I'm eager to work with you on creating that progress.
Can just go off script right from the beginning. You've spent your career listening to individuals about the experiences they're facing. What is it like to have spent your entire adult life listening to people as we face these challenges together?
It's complicated, of course, as anyone who's ever tried to intentionally listen would say, because it's both invigorating. There are people who are making changes on their personal levels and for their family units and for their loved ones, and they're pushing against systemic problems that really need that kind of passion and savvy. It's also hard to hear that, because we can be better and we have to be better. And that's what we're here to do today, is to listen to those people who've employed their savvy and who've made the change they need to make on a smaller system level. And how do we scale that up so that everyone else can have a better journey through their healthcare needs?
As we transition back to Sheila for her just to summarize where we've been on this journey, Sheila, you said something in the beginning of this process together that regardless of whether you're 3 days or 3 decades into this journey, you have expertise and you have a voice that nobody else has. Can you just share what it's like for you hearing these stories and amplifying these stories?
At the beginning of my journey, David, I was struck by the lack of understanding and expertise in this particular space. Very well-educated people, clearly proficient in their professions, and yet this piece was missing. They did not understand the challenges, the needs, and unique concerns of people of color in America. And it went way beyond whether or not you have insurance, or whether or not you have enough insurance, or whether you have an income. It really spoke more to culture. It spoke more to the lived experience, as you said, David, that these groups have on a day-to-day basis and how that impacts health. So from my perspective, this moment is a critical, pivotal moment for us to finally not only be educated about culture and language and diversity, but also to see how that impacts quality of care, diagnoses, treatment, survivorship, all of those things that all of us experience. But these groups in particular, people of African, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, or Native American descent, have a different lived experience. And if we don't understand that, we're going to miss the opportunity of helping all Americans achieve optimal health.
Sheila, what came from your working group is how new and relatively little progress has been made. It wasn't until the 1990s that the government first recognized these disparities publicly, correct?
That's absolutely right. In fact, it was 1985 when the government documented by a report, 3,000 pages of this documenting the disparities. Now, many of us knew anecdotally that they existed. We already knew that. We talked to physicians, we talked to healthcare professionals, and so there was definitely a gap. And clearly the government started out by trying to close the gap and to build bridges. And they made very incremental progress, but there was still no universal, standardized focus on weaving this into how you deliver care, how you educate patients, and how you motivate people to take charge and control of their health. That wasn't there, David. And now we're moving into the discussion of how we fix that. And it's an elephant. We have to eat this elephant one bite at a time. It's not easy. We've had decades of abuse, decades of marginalization, and decades of people dying prematurely from treatable, manageable disease. And that's where I think our passion comes from. That's got to stop. We've got to fix this. And everybody has a piece of the puzzle so that we all can collectively, organizationally, and individually be a part of the conversation and at the table. Not an afterthought, not an addendum, but woven in the fabric of what we do.
So as we start this new phase of change focused, Sheila, the place we have to start is where you started us. And so if I can have the Grit Health team put up Sheila's slide. Sheila, in your conversations, you heard from so many individuals across experiences, the values and the things that matter to them. And so just as an overview, can you reconnect the group, whether this is a review or their first time seeing, these are the things that you talked about in your working group?
Yes, really struck me as I began, as I said, my journey was the fact that there was so little commitment on the part of very preeminent and prominent organizations and individuals who were really passionate and compassionate about the needs of people of color. And so in 2007, there was a commission formed with over 50 organizations who came together to say, what role can we play to end health disparities? The National Medical Association, the National Hispanic Medical Association, and 50 medical and health professional organizations from the top down thought that it was important to actually put in place some standing guiding principles and what should drive us to do this. Why would anybody want to be culturally competent? And what does that mean? So these were the 10 that this auspicious group came up with in 2007. And number one, I think, is the key factor that influences what we do, and that's relationships. How do you connect with people? How do you embrace people and have a conversation that is difficult, but necessary? Second one, culturally and linguistically appropriate. It's more than putting a blackface on a brochure. It's more than just translating that brochure into Spanish. And it clearly has to be more about culture than those trappings, which are usually the easiest pieces to fix. The other one that I felt was important is number 7, comprehensive. We're not just talking about consumer, patient, community, family. We're talking about the whole ecosystem and how this has to be navigated for anyone to achieve their optimal health. And so comprehension involves, as I said, and you said in my introduction, from molecule to market, clinical research. How many people of color are in your clinical trials? And although the history has been these groups are hard to reach, they're difficult, it's not easy, I really submit to you that they're not hard to reach, they're hardly reached. No one reaches out to them and asks them to be a part of this program or the agenda of clinical research. And if you don't have the clinical research as the foundation of the practice of evidence-based medicine, you really don't have a message. So you really want to make sure that your product, your device, your intervention is safe and effective in everybody, so that outcomes can improve long-term, whether it's an orphan disease or one of the major diseases that these groups disproportionately suffer from and die from prematurely. So I would say that the relationships are key, the partnerships are key, making it culturally and linguistically appropriate is very important, making it comprehensive. Obviously, we want to be very sure that what we do resonates with the communities that we're reaching out to. And that takes conversation, David. That takes listening to patient voice. My lived experience on a day-to-day basis is very different from yours, simply because of the difference in how we look. And that factor has been the most significant factor that determines whether somebody gets care, gets screened prematurely, gets into treatment, and stays in treatment. So this clearly makes us understand that many people have to be at the table before we can resolve some of these problems. So with my group, I was struck by the frustration, the anger, and the clearly, how shall I say, the frustration of not being able to fix things individually. And that came out loud and clear. People vented a lot with their own personal experiences and how they came into the systemic, institutional, and structural racism, where they would beat their heads against the wall and couldn't go any further. Well, what's exciting to me about this group is we're about helping people overcome those barriers. They exist. That's woven in the fabric of our country, the dark history of how these groups have been treated and excluded and marginalized. But we want our patients to see that there's hope on the individual basis. We hope that there are many people going after how to solve these problems, but we want the individual patient, the family, the caregiver to be a part of today. How do you make sure that your loved ones get what they deserve and the quality that they deserve? And let's get beyond the conversation about underinsured, uninsured. And let's get rid of that word minority, David, because that really is a misnomer. We are not minorities. We are emerging or existing majorities. So if you just take it up from the commercial perspective, it's not only the right thing to do, it makes good business sense. Who are you reaching? Who is the target audience? And who are we trying to make sure have the right conversation? Because unfortunately, there are not enough physicians or healthcare professionals of color, if I would even want one. So how can you help me deal with a physician, a principal investigator, or a clinical research coordinator, or a brand man? How can you help them do a better job of reaching out? Don't just relegate it to the people of color on your team. Everybody is a part of this solution. And I always think about February being Black History Month. It's not about Black history, it's about American history. So what's the trajectory of health in the community so that we make sure we work together and we consolidate our efforts? So my team went to laying out the problems, amplifying that with lived experience and the patient voice to, okay, what can we do for change? Where can we make the change? What's the message? Who's the messenger? And excuse me, and how do we get it out there? So these groups, advocates, whether they've been doing this for 3 weeks or whether they've been doing it for 30 years, it's a journey and guidance is needed. So I'm very excited about Grit Health putting together the resources for anyone to start the journey as an advocate. Self-advocate first, family advocate, community advocate, and it goes beyond. If we can do that, then we will have definitely made a difference. And we can move the needle in terms of the arc of advocacy that all of us have probably been on in our journey in healthcare. So that's the time. This is the time. This is the watershed moment. This is the time when we all have to be cognizant of the role we play. It's not their problem, it's our problem. So we have to make sure that we have the voice at the community and do what's necessary. So I was excited about the energy of my group. I was excited about their need to keep this conversation going. It's a hard conversation. It makes people uncomfortable. And because of the lack of education, they want to make sure that they're not doing anything wrong. And clearly there's no silver bullet here. There's no slam dunk. You've got to work at it day by day, incrementally. Learn from what you've heard, learn from what you've seen, learn from what you've experienced, and put that in place so that people understand the real world. So it's going from having your diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging initiatives out of HR and have it migrate over to the brand team, to the professional affairs group, to the clinical research group. We've got to make sure that it gets into the right buckets so that we have the resources and the support for sustaining whatever programs we've had. I'm tired of doing these one-off events. And so it just drops off the radar screen because budget is an issue, resources are an issue. We need to change that. So we have to make sure that we have the intent, we have the intentional focus on making sure this is on the table and on the agenda and get the people into the room that can give us advice and counsel. We can't do everything, but we can certainly do something.
Sheila, I've been watching the stream of hearts and the comments as you're talking and how you're, impacting everybody here with us. I was so happy that you mentioned the differences and the disparities based on how people look and their lived experiences. Part of my identity is a white male. Part of
Mhm.
your identity is a Black woman. We also share in common caregiving and lots of other things. And to
Right.
sit together and learn to listen with cultural humility is a changing part of my life that's never a destination. Every new place we enter, we need to approach with humility.
It is humility, and that to me is even more important than competency. You've got to come
Mhm.
with the right heart set, the right mindset, and not be afraid of exploring new options, of widening your comfort zone, especially if your team doesn't have a lot of people of color, because sometimes that prevents people from having an open and honest conversation. And clearly, we've got to get beyond that. And I've had the privilege in my career of working with a number of enlightened professionals who get it, and they've become from all races and ethnicities. So it's not just something for Black people to do, or Latinos or Asians. And in the last couple of years, David, I've shared with you my excitement in working in the Native American community, even more so. So it's all a part of people in meeting them where they are, making sure that we understand historically some of the dark history of how these groups have been treated, but getting beyond that to say, what can we do to mitigate that abuse, to protect patients and their families and communities so that they have access to the quality healthcare they deserve, whether it's a product or whether it's a facility or an institution. I want to be on the agenda. I don't want to be an afterthought, because clearly we're all in this together, and we've got to start the conversation and the journey with the people who can move us along the continuum. Opting out is not acceptable. So if you are someone of color and you've met with these challenges and it's frustrating, we've got to get beyond that. And I've seen the difference that many of the programs that some of you have done, they do make a difference. How do you sustain it? How do you make it a part of the fabric of your organization or your company? That's the challenge. And how do we make sure that those at the helm are educated enough and motivated enough to see that it's about enlightened self-interest? You can make money and serve society. The two are not mutually exclusive. So don't just think this is a donation or a grant or you're doing somebody a favor. Let's just make it a part of how we look at the business of medicine and healthcare. And I think this is the moment where we can have those hard conversations and challenge organizations. What are you doing? We really need to make sure, if we're going to strive for health equity, we've got to tackle these disparities first. We've taken a major leap to health equity. We haven't even eliminated the disparities yet. So we've got to see, where are we on the continuum? What did we know? Where are we now? What do we need to focus on moving forward? And everybody has a piece of this pie.
Is exactly why Brad is so passionate to work on this project specifically. Brad, you have spent your career focusing on access challenges and creating resources to meet people where they are. So can you just give us a quick history of your working group?
Building from is, as Sheila just wonderfully pointed out, all of this is an us issue. All of this is the only way forward, fundamentally. And so what we've been working on in the Access to Care group that relates to everything Sheila just said in seeking to support that group's work is to think about what the barriers are and historically been to access, so that by knowing them, we can work on changes. We can work on ways that improve and increase access so that we can get at, exactly as Sheila was saying, those disparities that will allow us to make progress toward equity. And what we've been able to do, as you can see on the slide here, is just think about and document, based on existing work and our literature review, where the challenges are, but also what are some of the ways forward. As we listen to communities and individuals and people who are struggling with access to care issues, what do they say they want? Because that's the place to start. Listen to the voice of the people who are having the experience, the voices, I should say, and go from there as we think about where there is opportunity to make progress, and to think about specifically, as we can see here, the way that prioritizing preventative education, but communicating it in a way that makes sense to communities and geographies and cultures and language, such that it has some resonance with those people, such that it maximizes their agency and dignity. because it all starts from dignity at the end of the day. And we have opportunities here, again, as this group moving forward, to think about how we collectively build from that, building from the wisdom of all of the people on this call today.
Brad, having spent your career tackling this at the system level, this seems daunting. How can us as individuals be a part of the real change that's needed?
As individuals, this is a big ask, but I'm going to make it. As individuals, you can share your experiences. And I say that's a big ask because that sharing and that disclosing is a hard part for everyone. Every time someone has to acknowledge a difficult moment, an experience that they'd rather not have had, there's complexity and risk in that. So where it's safe, the chance to disclose those experiences makes it easier for the next person. Because we can give each other language, we can give each other savvy tips about how to negotiate broken systems. We can give each other ways to create safe within difficult spaces. So that chance to just share your voice, such as and when you feel comfortable, that's step one. That's a big thing you can do that will make a difference for the next you.
Brad, I know when I became an advocate, I didn't know how I could do anything that would matter. There are so many people doing so many things, but Sheila, to your point, the real change that's needed is still so early. And so that's why this work together is so critically important. It is the time now for change. And Brad, what you just shared is such an important introduction for the second resource that we're creating this year. And so just like our first resource is to provide practical tools and resources for people who are experiencing racism and discrimination, our second project and our second resource this year will be specifically for individuals to learn the landscape. What is patient voice and where can I use it? To say it's a gray box is an understatement. It is so many things in so many areas. And we have one of the world's leading experts in helping us create visibility into actually what is that landscape. So, and I know one of the things that Neil, who I'll introduce in a moment, is truly passionate about is that whether you want your voice to create change for you as an individual, to create change for peers and people that are going through what you're going through, or to change systems, whatever that is for you, that's right, that your voice belongs where you want it to be. And we want to help create places for that to fit. And so I'm going to introduce Neil Bertelsen to share the working group progress that he's made over the last few years, and also to talk about the project that he and Gary Nolan will be creating this year. I feel it's critical, Neil, to give you credit for your 25 years of experience and expertise in bringing the patient voice to life for healthcare decision makers. Neil, you've been a patient advocate in the field of HIV since the early 90s and the past chair of HTAI for patients and citizen involvement groups. He continues to work with HTA bodies around the world for improvements to patient engagement in HTA. Neil is also a board member of the Patient-Focused Medicines Development, an international multi-stakeholder effort to bring patients into the heart of medicine's research and development. And Neil, somebody who always speaks from a place of authenticity, I'm honored to welcome you to our conversation.
Oh, thanks ever so much, Dave. And it's a delight to be here again. And, you know, reflecting on that, you mentioned two main themes in your introduction, and they're so connected to each other. So back in the days with HIV, when I first became an advocate, I was just starting out. I was like Sheila was saying earlier, I was like 3 weeks into being an advocate at that time. And you know what? There was no such thing really as patient advocacy as we think of it today. But there was another thing missing back in that time, which was all the people that made decisions about our healthcare, locally with the doctors, the hospitals, nationally with governments and healthcare systems, and internationally with guidelines. None of them spoke to patients back then. So this whole concept that we sort of hear all the time now around patient engagement and patient voice, and we need patient insights before we can make decisions, that didn't exist back then, even as a concept. And so what we learned during those early days was that you see decisions being made around you as an individual or as a patient community that you have absolutely no chance of influencing in any way. And over that 25 years that you mentioned, what we've seen is we've seen more and more realistic opportunities growing to actually listen to patients, to hear patients, to understand what their voices are telling us, and not just listen to them, but actually take actions on what you've heard. And so we're starting to see healthcare systems, we're starting to see certainly the industry and companies like BMS really taking a stand at saying, let's really understand from patients what happens to them. And let's base our decisions where we can on those insights. And that's a whole new field, it's a whole new discipline. But we have to make sure as advocates, as individual advocates and as organizations, that we're co-creating this future together. That is still not the case that healthcare systems and others are saying, we want patient engagement or patient voice, and this is how we're going to do it. And once again, that we're on the receiving end of a system that has been designed, if you like, by others, but yet is seeking our input. And that's really what we focused on in the work stream, especially through last year at the Advocacy Exchange. And what we were looking to do there was thinking, what does this patient voice mean today? How do we get our voices heard? What are some of the challenges with that? And can we think of some principles that would help us build better patient engagement, patient voice initiatives that are truly welcoming and open? I think on the very first call that we had in this work stream, one of the things that we kept hearing from all of the people joining that very first call was that sometimes it feels like there's almost two tiers of advocates out there, or patient advocates. There are those that get invited to everything and they get invited to give their point of view, and there are the rest. And so one of the key principles is this open and inclusive. We said, whenever anybody, a decision maker, a company, whoever, is seeking input from the patient community, they have to really think about how they make that process as open and inclusive as possible, so that we hear a variety of voices, and it's not just the same voices we're hearing all the time. Really building on what Brad and Sheila have just been talking about, this should always represent the diversity of the patient population. There's no point seeking the views of a subset of the patient population. We'll be missing lots of really important pieces of information and guidance if we do that. So we have to make sure that we're always thinking about that diversity. Now, increasingly, stakeholders, healthcare professionals, regulators, those kinds of stakeholders, they'll say things like, yeah, but we need the patient community to be upskilled and understand our processes and our language. So they're always trying to push the burden of education on the patient community. You need to be better. You need to know more. You need to build your capabilities more. And what we came up with very much as a central principle was actually everybody needs to work on playing together nicely, if you like, listening to each other. And that requires capacity building on all sides. You can't just put this on the shoulder of one stakeholder like the patients and say, you need to build your capacity. Actually, everybody needs to be building their capacity, sharing experiences, sharing good practices, and we all can learn. The other thing that we really saw as an issue that we hope we can solve is individual stakeholders in the healthcare system duplicating the same sort of asks of the patient community. You see this a lot, and that wastes so many resources, and often the questions you're wanting to understand are the same. And so why can't we bring people together, ensure that people are not creating new resources, new burdens that are unnecessary because these questions have just been asked by somebody else. And finally, we realized that to do all of these things that are above, we needed new engagement models, innovative engagement models. So just inviting people to a call or around a table, that's great. That's a good start. but how do we reach more and more patients to get input from them? So we need new models for doing that. And that's very much where we left off at the end of last year, Dave.
Neil, you went to something so important about, in the 80s and HIV, not only were the people making decisions, not interacting with the peoples with lived experiences, but there was also so much stigma and misinformation. So it wasn't just starting from a neutral place. It was actually, how do we combat all of this blaming and stigma and all of the things that is being placed on this community dealing with these things? And Sheila, in our conversations, there were still hospitals in the United States into the early 70s where it said whites only. And so how do we blame people for not participating in things when the system prevented them from participating in things? And so, Neil, what you said about just not the 1% or the expert voices, but how are all of those experiences brought in? I'm so honored to know that the world has you doing that, and that together in this project, we're going to do more of that together. And that is now the transition to Gary Nolan. And Gary, as we've gotten to know each other over these past few years, every time we have a conversation, I'm struck by how immediately your mind and your heart goes to, yeah, but what's the structure? What's the governance? How are we going to make sure this change is sustainable and impactful? And what Gary Nolan brings to this whole co-creating change is his 17 years of medical education expertise, having developed a unique skill in forming, facilitating, and nurturing community collaborations to support mutually beneficial outcomes. He is an expert in identifying unmet educational needs, navigating sensitivities, and co-creating alliances that strive to lift all levels of knowledge. Gary applies his passion for co-creation and scientific rigor to all partnerships and collaborations he supports. Here he is for all of those reasons that we're honored to welcome you to this conversation and have you share what you've been working on.
Thank you, Dave. It's wonderful to be back, and thank you for having me back. I'd also like to just pass on my thanks to the Grit Health team and BMS for continuing this dialogue and continuing this conversation. It comes from a place, thinking back to 2020 when the Advocacy Exchange was first formed and founded. We were having very, very, very difficult conversations around how to navigate COVID, how to continue advocacy, how to continue to raise the profile of the therapy areas or the issues that we represent amongst a huge topic, which was a global pandemic. So, as difficult as those conversations were, some extremely fruitful outcomes were had from those discussions during 2020, but many of them only scratched the surface. And as we heard from Sheila and from Brad and now Neil, is that there is still so much more to do. We have literally scratched the surface of this. Sheila and Brad working on a different topic to that what myself and Neil have been working on, but so much common ground to share between us. Something that continuously strikes me when we have these conversations is around, there is for the first time a real desire and a real appetite from the industry to include the patient voice or the perspectives of those that are impacted by challenges and issues in decision making. But we're very, very quickly starting to realize that how do we actually do that in a way that is consistent and constructive? We hear all the time that we need to include the patient voice, or we need to ensure that the patient is represented in the decisions we're making, or those that are impacted by this issue are included in the decisions that we make. But there is no set out pathway to do this. So the conversations that we started to have around, okay, well, in terms of advocacy and how advocacy can support this change, and what does the future of advocacy look like in supporting this change of inclusion and patient involvement, we started to look at, well, where can advocacy go? And our working group, before we could even do that, we needed to figure out what is actually advocacy. And we very, very quickly discovered that advocacy is its disparity in its own. in the fact that it means so much to so many people, and it means different things to everyone that works in advocacy. Advocacy to me is very different to what advocacy means to you, Dave, and so forth. So we couldn't really define the future of advocacy without really starting to understand what advocacy is. So our group set about from the perspectives and experiences of individuals who have been in advocacy for 3 days or 30 years, really trying to figure out what is advocacy, because we couldn't really start to think about the future of advocacy and how advocacy can support the patient voice until we really started to figure out or understand or have a baseline around what advocacy is. And over several weeks, we started to define what advocacy is from the perspectives of advocates, and it does differ. And no group can define advocacy the same as one another. And what we started to come out with was what we can see here on the screen is what we called our pillars of advocacy, which is at the moment 6, but I'm sure if we were to continue the conversation, we would define furthermore. And what our group started to figure out, what that advocacy can mean a number of things. It can be around providing care to individuals, care to patients, or providing care to those that are impacted by a disease. So advocacy in some perspectives is providing care and support to those that are impacted by a disease or an issue. Empowerment, looking at how we can support or encourage or empower individuals to represent themselves or represent others in situations where there is inequity or a disparity. How can we empower patients to stand up for what is right for them, or empower organizations to stand up for those that they represent? Advocacy was also defined as access, ensuring that patients, carers, or organizations has access. Now, access in our space can sometimes mean access to drugs or therapies, but sometimes access can mean just having an opportunity to contribute towards a conversation or being at the table. Something that constantly came through from our conversations was that for many, many years, it has either been the industry's table or the physician's table that patient organizations or patient representatives get invited to. And half the time they're not invited to the table, or if they are invited to the table, it's at the last minute. So how can we ensure that everyone has access not only to therapies and treatments, but also access to conversations that inform change? And something that came up from this is, how do we create the patient advocacy or the advocacy table that we invite physicians and researchers and industry to? Advocacy was also defined as awareness, raising the profile of the disease or raising the profile of an issue amongst other more seen to be pressing issues. So advocacy could be seen as awareness. Research, once again, looking at how we can improve research by involving the patient voice earlier on in that conversation. But advocacy can be supporting new research or supporting ongoing research in a certain area, or quite simply providing funding or resource to support ongoing research. And then lastly, advocacy was defined as policy, supporting policy, driving change within policy to ensure that patients, carers, or those that are impacted by issues are represented in policy, and ensuring that policy is fairly put together in line with the needs of patients, carers, or patient organizations, and so forth. So our group really, sort of to summarize where we got to at the end of last year, was really defining what is advocacy. It's different to every organization. There is no right, there is no wrong, and you can choose any pillar you want to be an advocate. You can focus on awareness, you can focus on access, or you can focus on research, or you can focus on all of them or one of them. So we really started to look at what advocacy means to individuals. And the reason why that then moves into the project that we're looking at is that advocates don't tend to have much time with the microphone. And if they fail to use their 5 minutes of fame properly, they may never get that opportunity again to champion or advocate for what is important to them. So by helping advocates define their type of advocacy and create a script that communicates that as clearly and as quickly as possible, we hope to be able to support advocates in communicating their advocacy in their 15 minutes to ensure that they're as effective as possible.
I was trying to keep up with the comments as you were talking, and one of them that jumped out so powerfully is just how often this is done with a checkbox, right? We're at the end of the process. Did we just do something to be able to check that box? And what we're working together to do is the opposite of that, to start with those individuals so that it's not just a checkbox, but it's co-created in the approach together. And Sheila, I think so often about your words about courageous conversations. They're courageous not only because we're talking about difficult things, but the solutions haven't been created. And so we have to fit in that reality that we're working on process as much as we're working on challenge, right?
Absolutely. I think Gary and Neil and Brad have articulated it very well within the context of their working groups, but it is a cross-functional opportunity. And if you look at the context in which we're trying to do this, specifically the pharmaceutical industry, they have a very siloed approach to how they address problems. You know, the brand team, the professional resource groups. I mean, it's all kind of scattered. But when we come into the room, everybody's got to be at the table because everybody's got a piece of this pie, or they should. And we have to help them get to that place. So, and certainly Gary's work is clearly where I hope all of us will begin to take a position. Where are you in the advocacy journey? And where can you be? Where do you want to be? How do we get you from A to Z? Usually starts with self-advocacy, as it did with you, David, in your own personal health challenge. And that usually gets into a broader arena. But I think the industry definitely has to have a mind shift, a paradigm shift in how they do things. And that's not easy. The wheels turn slowly. But if we are inserting our conversation into whomever is in the room, hopefully it will show them that this thread is pulled through all of what they do. And somebody should be at the helm. We're really good at buzzwords: diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, justice. You know, we do all of that buzzword stuff that the industry is known for. But what does that really mean? How do we really effectuate that? I think that's where we have to challenge. My theme for the last 3 years has been disruptive. Challenge. Why are you doing it that way? Is it working? Well, it's not working. Let's try something different. And that difference may be to enlarge your comfort zone. And that's not a safe place to be for many of us to answer the questions. I mean, from protocol development to IRBs, you know, why do you do things the way that you do if you're not getting the right people in the room that can give you some important input? So it's this institutional shift. I've had the privilege of working with not-for-profits who are really tied to their grants and donations. So they may be somewhat limited to do what they do, even though they're passionate about doing it all. But we've got to get the mindset different in terms of how we operate and do what we do if we're going to ever see any change. Racism is alive and well. Every day, every time we hear these things over and over again. Not only racism, but homophobia, you know, or gender issues. I mean, all of that is bubbling up in a very unfortunate way. It's in the news every day. Cancel culture, banned books. You know, it's almost a denial of the beauty of diversity. And unless we come to terms with that, we need to make sure that we're not creating or being a part of the problem, but how do we fix this? And how do we make sure that patients get what they deserve and their unique concerns? That's why I was excited about social determinants that started to be a part of the conversation. Transportation, education, where you live, work, play, and pray. How do those things impact getting care, getting screened, staying in treatment? I mean, all of those dynamics seem daunting, but for your specific disease state, for your specific product or your intervention, how do those things play into the journey of the patient? I was struck by, after George Floyd was murdered, by the listening sessions. Proliferation of listening sessions. Well, did you listen? You heard, but did you listen? And did you make changes within your organization to address some of the glaring inequities and injustices that have persisted and have been pervasive for far too long? And healthcare people are kind of at the end of that advocacy trajectory because you kind of think, well, these people are humanitarian. They got into medicine to help people, but are they doing something that doesn't help people, even unconsciously? I think we've got to have those hard conversations.
Sheila, what you're talking about is as much about health as it is about humanity.
Yes.
And what I just heard you say was everybody has a role, and not only is everybody welcome, everybody is needed.
Can I just add a thought, just reflecting on Sheila's last comment? I think you said a fantastic thing, Sheila, about diversity and celebrating diversity rather than trying to close it down. And that's what we're talking about on both, both of these groups, both of these projects that we're talking about is not putting people inside a box and saying, this is the kind of person you are, or this is the kind of advocacy that you do, but actually allowing people to explore what their potential might be, what their interests might be, what their experiences are that have led them to this point, and building from that rather than trying to put people into different categories. And so I think that was a really good link that you made there, Sheila. So thank you for that.
My psychiatry friends, Neil, call it cognitive shortcuts. And Brad may support that. That's what we do when we see people. We size them up before they even open their mouths. And that's usually inaccurate or slanted at best. So how do we get beyond that? Because that's the system we live in. Everybody's in a bucket. And we know we're all multidimensional. Race is one factor. Gender is another. Age is another. So, I mean, it's complicated. So nobody ever said this was going to be easy. So we've got to make sure, again, target geographies. Where do you want to do your work? With whom do you want to do your work? What is the outcome you're looking for? So, make it smaller. Don't be looking at national entities. There's not a lot of money and not a lot of resources. Kind of break it down so that you can make progress in your disease state, in your ethnic segment, in a language group. Got some hard choices to make. You don't have infinite resources. So you've got to hone it in and to see what's feasible, realistic, measurable, and replicable.
Just to Sheila, to add to that as well, is I heard this saying a couple of years ago that if you don't change something, you're choosing something. And if we don't see change, you have this perception that everyone's accepting what hasn't changed. But if you don't know what you need to change or have the tools or resources to change it, how can you ever change something? So therefore, there's an acceptance of we're choosing that, when that is never the case. We just don't know how to change it or where to start. And so for that saying, for me, is really important, that when people say, if you don't change something, you're choosing something, it's, well, what do we need to change? How do we change it? And how can we support people with the tools and resources to change it? Because they're probably not accepting of what they're currently living through at the moment.
So true, Gary. So I don't care if you call me Black, just don't call me invisible. I mean, give me a presence, acknowledge my existence. And then the challenges about how to talk to me, reach me, motivate me, hopefully will be discussed in these sessions that you have with your group. So again, it's education. We know a lot about these groups, but we don't know a lot about what makes them tick with regards to healthcare. So the data are scant to non-existent about some of these groups and prevalence of disease, morbidity, and mortality. So data is a good place to start. There's a lot out there, but hone it in. Pick an ethnic group, a disease state, a condition, see if you can move it in your own way within the context of where you are.
To say anything to bring that back to next steps, it's so important, Sheila. We talked about changing the process. We're not here to prescribe the process. Our first step together is going to be to ask how to do this next work together. And so something you can expect to receive from us if you shared your information is next steps on how we create that process with you, not for you, not give it to you, but with you. And so that will be our follow-up from the Grit Health team. I also want to note that all of the slides and information that were shared during this session live on the advocacyexchange.com platform. So if you go to the Advocacy Exchange exhibitor booth, the slides that each of these leaders shared, the member guide, the journey that we've followed, it's all there. So if you want to learn more or dig in deeper, that information is there. And something I have to share is our gratitude for the Bristol Myers Squibb team and their global advocacy leaders to create a table that is everybody's table versus to prescribe something and then go out is risky, and it's different and it's new. And so as we applaud patients and advocates and every individual for changing the future, I want to applaud the BMS team for having the faith in individuals to change healthcare and humanity. Thank you to everyone for being here together. I want to thank Sheila Thorne, Brad Love, Neil Bertelsen, Gary Nolan for everything you all have done in these last couple of years, and for together these resources that we're going to co-create with everybody. It took me 10 years as an advocate to find people and make these connections. And although COVID has challenged the world, I feel like it's sped up our closeness and the things we can do in many ways. And so we hope you feel that same hope and connectedness, and we hope you stay with us for this journey. Thank you to everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, so bye.